This day is given to us. Beyond anything we could create or earn, regardless of whether deserved or undeserved, this day comes to us as a gift from the universe, a gift from God, a gift from life itself. So come and let us worship with gratitude for this and so many gifts, with humility for our shortcomings, resilience for the struggles ahead, and let us worship with hope that we will continue to transform our lives and to transform our world. And with these words, let us join together in worship as we join together in song. Well, it is so good to be together. We are glad to have you with us this morning for our virtual worship service here at the Unitarian Church of Baton Rouge. We welcome you to joining together with us in virtual community. I am Reverend Eric Poza, interim minister. I'm pleased to be joined by our music director, Lee Hartman, and running our AV today is Mike Patton. And we will, of course, next week be joined once again, though in the new role, by our incoming senior minister, formerly associate minister, Reverend Nathan Ryan, who, after a bit of time away for a family time, will be returning in his new role on Thursday of this week. And he will be with you in the sanctuary this coming Sunday as well. So we look forward to welcoming him back in his renewed role. We are a congregation with much happening in our church, so we do invite you to take a look at our church website and get to know some of the things that are happening here. And glad you are with us today to join us in an exploration, the beginning of an exploration that we'll be touching on at various points throughout the coming months on the theme of covenant, one which is central for us Unitarian Universalists in many ways, and we'll explore how in a few moments. For now, we're glad you're with us. Thank you for coming.
Good morning. One of the joys of being a religious educator is facilitating the making of covenants with our children and youth. If you've never worked in an RE classroom or attended a youth event, you may not be familiar with this. At the beginning of every class year and at the beginning of every youth event, it's the custom for adults and children, or adults and teens, to sit down together and to write out the promises they make to each other about how they will make this a safe and welcoming and sacred space together. One of my formative experiences about the power of covenant actually came out of a difficult situation. Several times I've been fortunate to be invited to be one of the adult advisors for Youth Caucus at General Assembly. General Assembly is our large denominational convention, 3,000 to 5,000 adults and 200 to 400 youth. And these several hundred high school youth are the Youth Caucus. The Youth Caucus programming is put together and run by a small group of youth leaders, guided and mentored by a smaller number of adults. But the programming is put together and put on by the youth themselves. This particular year, the youth leaders had planned an opening assembly where they went over the rules: no drugs and alcohol, no violence, no sexualized behavior, respect for the facility and the people in it, and some housekeeping details: wear your name tag at all times in the convention center, make sure your sponsor knows where you are, that kind of thing. And because they had a brief period of time, they went over it quickly, got everyone's agreement, and moved on to the other things that they felt they needed to cover. Well, as sometimes happens, that evening, a couple of youth broke one of the rules, one of the big rules that you can get sent home for from General Assembly, and in fact, they were asked to leave the caucus. And the youth leadership were very upset by this, not so much by the fact that someone had broken the rules, but as one of them said, "We never actually made a covenant. We gave them rules and asked them to follow them, but we never made promises to each other about how we would support each other." And so they decided to call together all of the youth and make a covenant of promises. Not a small thing to get several hundred youth to give up a free period to come and sit together and talk about behavior and promises, but they did. And they explained briefly what had happened, but then asked some deeper questions. Who are we? What are our values? How do we want to support each other? How do we want to support our larger Unitarian Universalist community? And at the end of that hour, they had promises about how they would spiritually grow, how they would support each other, and how they would support the larger UU community. It was a beautiful thing to see, although it came out of some very deep pain, and it was formative to me to recognize how powerful promises are, and the promises that we can make to each other about how we will build a better world and how we will walk towards that better world together in community.
It is our tradition as we gather on Sundays, be it in the same physical room or virtually, to share stones to mark life transitions that may have impacted us, and to lift up the names of those who are impacted. We do have a couple of names to lift up this morning, thinking about Tom Haney, Gloria Bockrath, and Joy Ferrara. And we know that many would, if they had been here this morning physically, come forward at this time to place a stone in our chalice, as is our ritual. If you have one that you would share, I invite you in the chat next to the YouTube window, video window, to note what you would share, either with an asterisk to note the stone itself, or if you'd like to say who it's for, please feel free to do that, and I'll place the stones in absentia for you. and we light the flame in our chalice, saying together the words, with hope to make this a better world, we light this flame. Its light is a symbol of the power of love.
The young minister had a promising future. He had been a brilliant scholar at Cambridge University. And when he was appointed the rector at St. Andrew's Parish in the town of Norwich, his fine preaching brought in such large crowds that they had to put extra seating into the sanctuary. But his ministry was troubled because there were deeper convictions to his conscience that went against the new doctrines and practices that the bishops and the magistrates of the Church of England had recently imposed. And church membership had recently been required of all citizens. But this minister could not imagine that any external church authority might be authentic. Not bishops, not kings, not historical creedal statements. None of these could establish a church community. No, as one author put it, this minister believed that the church was to be constituted by a promise, a covenant among its members to venture together as individuals in the ways of the Spirit with entire integrity. The writer who wrote those words about this minister, by the way, was the Unitarian Universalist minister and historian, the Reverend Alice Blair Wesley. And Alice Blair Wesley adds that this young minister, his name was John Robinson, he did eventually join with such a freely formed congregation. It was in the small English town of Scrooby. Yes, that's its name. And this was in the year 1607. There was a young member of that group, a 17-year-old young man named William, who described the formation of the church, who wrote about it with these words. There was first one stood up and made a covenant, and these two joined together, and so a third. And these became a church, say they. Well, what was this covenant? What did it say? Now, the language theologically may be a little different than we might use today, but it's still meaningful, I think, to hear. The Lord's free people joined together by a covenant of the Lord into a church estate in his fellowship of the gospel, to walk in his ways made known or to be made known unto them according to their best endeavors, whatsoever it should cost them. Again, not the theological language that many Unitarian Universalists today use, but the underlying points still resonate. These were people of faith who made free choices to join together, to become a church community by promising to one another that they would do their best to journey together in the ways that were valuable and meaningful to them, and to stay open to learning new ways of living, of being church together, of living out their faith, and to do so regardless of the cost. And for this church in the early 17th century, the cost was high. Persecution from the crown was strong. They fled to Holland for a time, tried returning to England, but eventually a large portion of this congregation set sail for the New World. And you may have guessed by now that the ship they sailed upon was the Mayflower. These were the pilgrims who landed in what's now Plymouth, Massachusetts in 1620, just 400 years and a couple months ago. What might surprise some of you, however, is to hear that not only is the church that came with them, First Parish in Plymouth, Massachusetts, not only is that church still an active church to this day, but that church now is a member of the Unitarian Universalist Association. The Church of the Pilgrims is a UU church. This is our heritage, not just for the history of Plymouth's First Parish, but for Unitarian Universalism more broadly, and for the meaning and covenant of our liberal religious tradition. And I say that knowing how fraught that tradition, that history is. We are, in recent years, coming more and more to terms with the negative, oppressive consequences of these immigrants, these colonials, these colonists coming over from England. Religious refugees, yes, but ones who also pushed out and often oppressed the Wampanoag and others in their area. And yet, we hold multiple truths. And even as we recognize the damage and the harm that has been caused, we can also acknowledge that we have a history, a legacy that ties back to this group. And even as we reject the negative aspects of it, there are positive aspects, such as what it means to be together in covenant, that we can, and I think should, explore together, as we will today.
Flowing by the throne of God.
Covenant is an enormously important concept throughout Unitarian history and increasingly so today as well. And it's one that I regularly preach on very early in my interim ministry periods, often in the first month. There were other priorities this time, other reasons for shifting that, but I'm glad to have an opportunity now as we start to consider, and I'll say more about in what specific ways, what covenant might mean for UCBR going forward also. But it's important first to understand what a covenant is and what it's not. What it is an agreement. It's a set of promises that mutually and freely are agreed to by two or more people and that have a moral dimension. In other words, they make claims about our actions. So it's like a contract, but what makes it different from a contract is that it doesn't have an external enforcer. I mean, think about it. If you're in a contract with somebody else and they break the contract, what do? You sue them. You take them to court. At least you can. If a covenant is broken, there's no court as such to take anyone to. We work it out amongst ourselves through our mutual agreement. So I have known of situations when a church had a covenant that there were people in the congregation who violated that covenant, not unlike what Kathy described earlier with the youth at General Assembly, even though they had started on a different basis than covenant. So instead of having a set of rules imposed from above, when a church is in covenant, its members with one another, there's no bishop that intervenes. I'm sure the UUA will send support for our conflict resolution process if we ask for it, but it's up to the local church to ask. The onus is on us, not anybody beyond us. And covenant is also different from creed. We often say, in fact, that we are a church of covenant, not creed. But sometimes we only hear the not creed part of that. A creed is a statement of shared beliefs. A covenant is a statement of mutual promises. As the Unitarian Universalist writer Doug Mutter wrote in our denominational magazine, the UU World, some years ago, in a creed, people look outward and agree they see the same things. In a covenant, they look at each other to exchange promises. Yet covenants, promises, serve as the basic ethical concept for Unitarian Universalists. I'll say more in a few minutes about the theologian James Luther Adams, who I've spoken of before. But he quotes the Jewish theologian Martin Buber, noting that human beings are promise-making, promise-breaking, and promise-renewing peoples. Though Mutter does warn, the danger of a covenant statement, especially, is that like a creedal statement, in his words, like a creed, a covenant can become a meaningless recitation. But taken seriously, a covenant lays out a challenging spiritual path. Now, there was a period of time in the 20th century, in the height of our embrace of individualism, not only culturally, but within Unitarian and UU circles, that the importance of covenant was lost. Some of the newer congregations, certainly it was true of the congregation I first joined at the time, the congregation in Denton, Texas in the 1990s, did not at that time have any sense of covenant. But increasingly in recent decades, its importance and prominence has grown. So the relevance for exploring this core ethical approach to our shared religious life is rich and meaningful. And we'll unpack it in a couple of different ways, as we go forward in the next few minutes.
I invite you to join me now in a time of deeper sharing, a spirit of prayer, reaching deep within yourself, far beyond yourself, connecting with what you know to be sacred. Let us pray. Spirit of life and of love, God whom we know by so many names and mystery beyond all of our naming, we gather together in our various locations, yet sharing in this bright, cool morning that greets us here on the opening days of this new year. A time when so many of us look forward to the possibilities of new beginnings. And even as we do so, and even as we so hope, we know that there are continuing struggles that we face in these times, and that our physical separation during this pandemic, our immediate political strife, and so many other challenges that face us are not going to resolve immediately. But help us in this unique moment to come together in the sharing of our resilience for these struggles and the hope for what may change, what likely in some ways will change, even as we don't know exactly how. And may that resilience and that hope work together to carry us forward, to help connect us even across the physical distance with one another, with this church, and with that which is of greater purpose and import for us all. So may it be for us all. Amen.
There are so many examples throughout our religious history, our religious heritage, of covenant being lifted up as important. It goes far earlier than the Pilgrims, earlier even than their Christian origins, to the early history and the scriptures of the Jewish people that the Pilgrims read so frequently in their Bibles, what they knew as the Old Testament. But there is passage after passage in Jewish scripture speaking of covenant between God and humans, God and the people of Israel. One famous one from Genesis chapter 9 talks about the covenant between God and Noah, and uses the rainbow as a symbol for the covenant that they've made together. But I'm even more struck by an example about King David, talked about in Jewish scripture. Now this is, again, for those who like to check the passages, it's 1 Samuel, the first book of Samuel, chapter 18. The first few verses speak of the relationship between David and Jonathan. Say that the soul of Jonathan was bound to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. Now, this is a passage that actually is often lifted up in recent years by queer theologians, and particularly gay male Jews and Christians see this as a model for a loving same-sex relationship. And it's an example of a covenanted relationship. A relationship where Jonathan and David have made promises to each other about how they're going to be together. It's a reminder to us that even in our interpersonal relationships, coming to agreements with each other is sacred. It's sacred work, that kind and intentionality of coming together. And it's true not only in one-to-one relationships, regardless of how romantic and or sexual they may or may not be. There is also something about groups of people, like religious congregations, like UU churches, coming together in covenant with one another, coming to understand that they've made promises to be together. Because when we're not together because of some shared belief, which we are emphatic about rejecting, we have beliefs, but we don't require particular ones. We do not ban particular ones. What we have instead are the promises we share, sometimes articulated explicitly, and I see value in that help us to form our relationships and form our community more fully. Understanding that work to be sacred, that is what carries us forward and gives meaning and purpose to our continued existence as a gathered community, as a self-governing community. And we'll see more about the specifics of what it looks like next. Sometimes the covenants we live under are explicit, clearly stated, articulated. Other times they're implicit. They're implied by the culture, the ethos of the community, the group, the congregation. I do certainly think there are advantages to an explicit covenant statement, but whether that's present or not, there's something valuable we can learn. Some real genuine life lessons that come out of our understanding of ourselves as living in covenant with one another. And one of those lessons is that it helps us to see there's a healthy balance to be struck between the individual and the community. It has been true for many years, it had been true for many years in Unitarianism and UUism that individualism was the order of the day. And in recent decades, that has been waning as we've developed more of a collective understanding of our religious lives. And someone who I've quoted before, the Unitarian theologian James Luther Adams, points us in this direction. He wrote clearly about the value of covenant. From Cage to Covenant was one essay he wrote on this subject, in which he wrote, "The covenant is for the individual as well as the collective. We are responsible not only for individual behavior, but also for the character of the society." And stating our covenants, our promises with each other, helps to make that responsibility clear. It can certainly be true for a church, because there are many individuals from church that are involved in many groups. I think here of the various branches groups that so many of you are involved in. And yes, there may well be within each branches group a strong identity, and also there's a shared set of understandings of what it means to be part of the Unitarian Church of Baton Rouge writ large. So that balance between the individual and the collective is one lesson to learn. Another is the importance of commitment. Doug Mutter, writing again in the UU World magazine, who I quoted earlier, gives a particular example. He talks about marriage vows, which he says are one type of covenant. They say nothing about what the couple believes, but they describe the commitments that the individuals are making to each other. And while that happens in a particular way in marriages, it's true of other couples and groups that come together, again, like congregations. Here at the Unitarian Church of Baton Rouge, my understanding is that there is a past statement of covenant, but in recent years there's not been much of a lived sense or lived memory of one. And the value I find in them is when, like the youth at General Assembly that Kathy spoke of, not only do we come together to articulate the covenant, but as I've seen happen directly when I served as minister at a youth camp, a district youth camp a decade ago, the regular reviewing of the covenant. The youth who were present would come together every day for 15 minutes and just check in with each other about how are we doing at holding up to this, at living this out. That made it a vital part, really the beating heart of the community that was formed. And it was an incredible treat to see Unitarian Universalism lived out so intentionally and explicitly in that youth camp. Frankly, far more than in some congregations I've seen. So while we may not have recently here had our sense of that, our board has been speaking, even before I arrived, about the importance of articulating our covenant. And I look forward to working with them to help facilitate this work alongside our newly called senior minister. So again, that's one of the lessons, commitment. Here's another lesson, really two interlocking ones, trust and risk. Both are important. And the Buddhist teacher and writer Sharon Salzberg articulates this. She gives the example that sometimes, in her words, faith means trust. In your reflections, you can contemplate, is there some quality within yourself that you trust? Awareness, love, critical thinking. What do you trust? She went on to recount, I remember having a great deal of difficulty with my meditation practice at one point in my life. And my teacher, U Pandita, said to me, you just sit and walk. The Dharma will take care of the rest. Dharma, the Buddhist understanding of the ultimate in life. Sharon Salzberg goes on to say that I was trying too hard to make the practice work. And the faith that came from simply trusting that the practice would work, all by itself, had been tremendously helpful for me. And as I conclude this sermon in a couple of moments, I'll share a story to help illustrate this for us Unitarian Universalists as well.
We come together in the spirit of covenant and create together a whole that's greater than the sum of its parts. Just as marriage vows create a marriage that is greater than the two individuals who enter into it, so too can an understanding of sharing promises create something larger. And that something larger takes on a reality that calls for and deserves our support, our tangible support. And it includes promises to lift up our values, not only amongst one another, but in the community around us as well. And that's part of why when we come together to share our material generosity through the offering, which we'll do momentarily, we also are renewing our practice of sharing that offering with other organizations in the community. This is something we've made a practice of, but had, during the pandemic, of course, had some struggles maintaining, so we're catching back up to where we were. We are today in particular sharing our plate with an organization we'd already promised to support, Planned Parenthood of Baton Rouge, an organization which was actually founded just over a century ago in part by a Unitarian, Margaret Sanger, and others who sought reproductive and other health care services for women to be accessible. They have done incredible work in incredibly challenging circumstances in many cases, and we are glad to support them. We invite you to support them and us. Any contribution made online or by mailing in a check, and I believe we're posting in the chat how you can contribute online or even by text, that if it's not specifically designated as pledge, it will be shared with Planned Parenthood today and with other organizations on future Sundays. We invite you in that spirit to give generously as the offering is now received.
There was a story I was told some years ago by a fellow minister that illustrated for me in a really wonderful way what it can mean for a congregation truly to live its covenant, both the parts implied and the parts explicitly stated. This was back in the 1990s when this minister received a phone call. This minister now retired, but received a phone call in the church office from a woman who was considering attending the church, was interested in it, but had questions. And this often happens. But this woman, we'll call her Elizabeth, she had some particular kinds of questions about how she might be received by the church, accepted by it. See, Elizabeth was a trans woman and was just beginning the process of living her life openly as the woman that she had known herself for many years to be, and was understandably wary and curious whether or not the church would accept her, and asked for a frank assessment from the minister about that. And this minister, I think rather wisely, noted that they had not up to that point had someone attending the church who they knew to be transgender, and therefore he could not promise what her reception would be. But he did note that it was important to the congregation to live out the commitment it had made by becoming a welcoming congregation, to truly embrace those who were lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender. And that it was true to themselves to be that way, even though he couldn't give an assessment as to an experience for others. Well, that was enough for this woman to take the risk. She did start attending the congregation and started attending the women's group. Now, I have heard stories of trans women trying to become involved in women's groups in churches and other places and not being accepted. And one would understand why she might have been hesitant. But the experience at this church was very different. And she was embraced warmly by this women's group, who supported her through her transition in intangible and specific ways, even with some specifics that I, having been raised as a man, and she, having been raised inaccurately as a man, socialized by male norms in her childhood, had not grown up learning about what it is to live as a woman in contemporary society, even down to simple things or small-scale things, perhaps, as tips about hair care and makeup that many women learn from an early age in our society, but Elizabeth had not. And she was so grateful for the warmth and the reception that she received at the congregation, that when she left a couple of years later, and my understanding she only left because she moved to another city, had to have a geographical change, she left the congregation with a gift, a large cross-stitch framed, hung on the wall of the congregation's covenant statement. Now, this was a congregation that used a historical covenant statement. In fact, it's found in our hymnal as one of the readings in the back. And though I believe they adapted the language slightly, here's the original version of it. Love is the doctrine of this church. The quest of truth is its sacrament, and service is its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge and freedom, to serve human need to the end that all souls shall grow into harmony with the divine. Thus do we covenant with each other and with God. I have visited this church. I have seen this cross-stitch hanging on its walls. And it is a church and a story that shows us how a group coming to live in covenant, to live in accordance with the promises that those in the group make to one another, living in that way can transform lives. And it can transform our own as well as the lives of those who share in our covenantal commitments, who can share in the trust and risk-taking that can come out of relying on those covenantal promises, and can help us to balance our lives as individuals and our life in community. For when we walk together in the ways known and to be made known as meaningful to our lives and our faith, then we're opening ourselves to one another, and we're opening ourselves to a larger spirit. So may it be in our church and in our lives. Amen.
And so, as we go forth from this sacred time, from the many sacred places where we have gathered, let us go knowing ourselves to be graced with blessings, blessings of freedom, blessings of wholeness. And may we, even as our worship now ends, go forth in the service that now begins. May we serve this hurting world in the spirit of love. Thank you for joining with us today, and go in peace.